It happened so fast that no one understood what they were seeing at first. 1 second, the crowd was roaring, the energy electric, the flash of cameras blinding. And then, just like that, security was shoving him back, their hands on his chest, their voices firm, their orders sharp. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a joke. It was real. The lead actor, the face of the franchise, the man whose name was printed across every billboard, was being removed from his own movie premiere like some random trespasser. Are you serious? His voice was calm, low, but there was something underneath it, something unreadable, something dangerous. Step back, sir. The guard's tone was clipped, absolute, the kind of voice used to giving orders, not receiving them. Dwayne inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring just a little, a flicker of irritation passing over his face. He could hear the whispers now, the fans behind the barricades, the way their confusion twisted into outrage, the sharp realization cutting through them. That's The Rock. They're kicking out The Rock? What is happening? A wave of phones lifted higher, cameras rolling, the red carpet flashing with a new kind of attention, not for the A-list stars striking their perfect poses, but for this, for the impossible, for the absolute madness of what was unfolding. And still, Dwayne did nothing. He let it happen. But that was the part no one understood yet. He wasn't allowing them to remove him. He was waiting. And what happened next would be something none of them would ever forget. Jeff, the head of security, had seen it all before, overzealous fans trying to push past the velvet ropes, desperate nobodies hoping to get a taste of the spotlight, influencers who thought their online following meant they could walk anywhere like they owned the place. His job was to keep things under control, to make sure the night ran smoothly, to keep out anyone who didn't belong. And this guy? Something about him didn't sit right. The way he moved, too sure of himself. The way he smiled, almost amused. The way he didn't demand attention but commanded it. I need you to step back now, Jeff repeated, his hand still firm on the man's chest, his grip tightening just slightly. Dwayne's expression barely changed, but the air around them did. It was subtle at first, a shift in pressure, the kind of moment that happens before a storm, when the wind stills and the world holds its breath. He didn't shove Jeff's hand away, didn't yell, didn't make a scene. But there was something in his eyes now, something that sent a flicker of doubt racing up Jeff's spine. I'm supposed to be here, Dwayne said again, slower this time, as if giving Jeff a chance to realize the mistake before it became something bigger. I don't care who you think you are, Jeff snapped, a threat of impatience bleeding into his voice. You need to move. The crowd reacted before Dwayne did. What the hell? That's his movie. Are they serious right now? You're kicking out Dwayne Johnson? A ripple of shock tore through the spectators, disbelief giving way to something more volatile. This wasn't just some fan getting escorted away. This was a global superstar, a man whose name was synonymous with box office success, a man who had spent decades building a career that made him one of the most beloved figures in Hollywood. And here he was, being treated like he didn't belong at his own premiere. One of the younger security guards hesitated now, shifting uncomfortably. Jeff, maybe we should. But Jeff was too locked in, too determined to assert control over the situation. I said move. And then, in front of 100 cameras, 1,000 eyes, and millions more who would see the footage by morning, Jeff made the worst mistake of his career. He shoved Dwayne Johnson. It wasn't hard, just enough force to make a point, enough to get the guy off his carpet, enough to make it clear that Jeff was in charge. But it was enough. Enough to make the fans scream in outrage. Enough to send a jolt of disbelief through every A-lister watching from a distance. Enough to make the world stop for a second. And enough to make Dwayne finally react. Not with anger. Not with violence. Not with anything Jeff could have predicted. Dwayne took a slow step back, inhaled deeply, rolled his massive shoulders like he was loosening up before a fight. And then he laughed. A deep, rumbling, genuinely amused laugh. Not forced, not mocking, not even angry, just pure, unfiltered disbelief at the absurdity of what had just happened. You just shoved me? He grinned now, shaking his head in a way that said he was enjoying this way more than he should have. At my own premiere? The realization was beginning to dawn on Jeff now. A sickly, creeping sensation that worked its way up from his gut, something that started as a whisper in his mind before turning into a deafening roar. The man in front of him wasn't just some VIP. He wasn't just another guest on the list. And he sure as hell wasn't supposed to be thrown out. His mouth opened, his lips parting just slightly as the color drained from his face. The moment stretched, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. And then, before anyone could say another word, Dwayne moved. Not toward Jeff, not away from him, but toward the nearest camera. He turned smoothly, flashing that exact same grin that had made him one of the biggest stars on the planet. And then, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, folks, I guess this is a first," he announced, his voice rich with amusement. "Getting kicked out of my own movie premiere. You guys getting all this?" He gestured at the sea of fans with their phones raised. "Hope you're recording, 'cause this is gold." The crowd erupted. Laughter. Outrage. Disbelief. Jeff went pale. And Dwayne? He just stood there, watching the chaos unfold, completely in control. And the real fun was just about to begin. The cameras didn't stop flashing, but now they weren't aimed at the stars posing elegantly on the red carpet or the film's director giving interviews. Every lens, every recording phone, every eye in the crowd had shifted toward the absolute absurdity unfolding in real time. Dwayne Johnson, standing just outside the velvet ropes of his own premiere, laughing like he had just heard the most ridiculous joke of his life, while security, rigid, tense, suddenly uncertain, stood in front of him, caught in a situation that none of them had ever been trained for. Jeff felt the weight of 100 glares, his own security team shifting awkwardly, the realization settling into his gut like a brick. The way Johnson turned so smoothly to the cameras, the way he spoke directly to the audience like this was some perfectly planned publicity stunt. The way he looked completely unfazed despite the fact that he had just been physically pushed back by security at his own event. Nothing about this felt normal, nothing about this felt manageable. One of the assistants, a woman with a clipboard clutched so tightly in her hands that her knuckles had turned white, rushed up, her expression frantic, her eyes darting between Jeff and Johnson like she was trying to process the sheer insanity of what was happening. "Mr. Johnson, I'm so sorry. I have no idea what's—" "It's all good," Dwayne cut in, still grinning, still way too calm for someone who had just been manhandled by his own security team. "I mean, you guys did just kick me out of my own premiere. But hey, mistakes happen, right?" His voice was light, almost playful, but there was an unmistakable sharpness to it now, something just beneath the surface, something that made it very clear he was letting them recover before this turned into something a lot worse. Jeff exhaled slowly, his body still locked in its defensive posture, his instincts screaming at him to regain control, but there was no control left to be had. The moment had shifted too quickly, the power balance completely flipped, and now the crowd wasn't just watching, they were reacting. "This is insane. They really didn't recognize The Rock? I swear to God, this better be a joke. What kind of security doesn't recognize the main actor? This is about to go viral so fast." A younger guard, barely out of his 20s, took a hesitant step forward, his face stricken with a kind of dawning horror. Jeff." Jeff's jaw clenched, his pulse thudding in his ears. His entire career flashing before his eyes as the woman with the clipboard finally snapped out of her stunned silence and turned on him with the full force of someone who had just realized their entire job might be on the line. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice low but furious, her nails digging into the clipboard as she spoke through gritted teeth. "Do you even know who you just touched? Who you just embarrassed? This is his event. He is the star. He is the reason this entire thing exists." "I thought," Jeff started, but she cut him off with a sharp shake of her head, her expression a mix of disbelief and rage. "You thought what? That's some random guy in a perfectly tailored suit, walking toward his own premiere, surrounded by his own fans, looking exactly like the most recognizable face in Hollywood. Was just some nobody trying to sneak in." Jeff opened his mouth, then closed it again. Dwayne raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying himself now. "Man, I really gotta start carrying ID, huh?" The fans lost it at that. The laughter, the shouting, the way people were now fully engaged in the complete and utter humiliation of the security team, it was spiraling fast, too fast, and Jeff knew he had already lost. His position, his authority, his entire reputation gone in a matter of minutes, slipping through his fingers in front of thousands of live witnesses. The clipboard woman turned back to Johnson, her demeanor instantly shifting to something close to desperation, her voice high-pitched with panic. "Mr. Johnson, please, let's get you inside. This is just a complete misunderstanding, a total—" Dwayne didn't move. He looked at Jeff. He looked at the younger security guards shifting uncomfortably. He looked at the sea of fans, their cameras recording every second, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, amusement, and complete second-hand embarrassment for the security team that had somehow made the worst mistake possible. Then, without a word, he stepped forward. Not toward the entrance. Not toward the frantic assistant. Toward Jeff. The security team tensed. The energy in the air sharpened into something unspoken, something instinctive, something that made every person present hold their breath. Dwayne didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of Jeff, the difference in their builds suddenly more obvious, the sheer presence of the man overwhelming. Jeff swallowed. For the first time all night, he felt small. Dwayne studied him, not with anger, not with gloating satisfaction, but with something worse, understanding. "You thought I didn't belong here," he said, his voice quieter now, but heavier. "You looked at me, and you made a decision." Jeff felt his throat tighten. The crowd had gone silent. The cameras still flashed, but the energy had changed again. "You didn't recognize me." "That's fine," Dwayne continued, his expression unreadable. "You were doing your job, right? Making sure no one who looks like they don't belong gets past you." The weight of the words hit hard. Jeff couldn't respond. Because what could he say? Dwayne held the silence for just a moment longer, letting it sink in, letting the entire world feel the gravity of what had just happened, what it meant, what it revealed. And then, just like that, the tension shattered. He smiled. He clapped Jeff on the shoulder, lightly, but still enough to almost knock him off balance. "No hard feelings, brother. But you were trending on every platform right now." The crowd exploded. Laughter. Cheers. Chants of The Rock. The Rock. The Rock. Jeff's face turned ghost white. "And Dwayne?" Without another word, without even looking back, he turned and walked inside, past the stunned security team, past the frantic assistant, past the flashing cameras that captured every second of it, as if nothing had happened at all. But everyone knew something had happened. And Jeff knew that by morning, he wouldn't just be a security guard anymore. He'd be the guy who tried to throw out the rock. And the world? It never forgets. The energy inside the theater was nothing like outside. Out there, the crowd had been a chaotic mess of emotions, shock, outrage, amusement, but in here, it was controlled, polished, the kind of manufactured elegance that came with high-profile Hollywood events. A-listers sipped champagne, executives exchanged knowing glances, and journalists whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what had just happened on the red carpet. The massive screen loomed over the audience, the Titan's Wrath logo glowing brilliantly, the entire room buzzing with anticipation for the first showing of what was supposed to be the biggest movie of the year. But no one could focus on that anymore. Not after what had just taken place outside. Dwayne Johnson walked through the entrance like nothing had happened. No anger, no tension in his shoulders, no urgency in his step. Just that same confident stride, that same unreadable expression, that same effortless dominance that made people stop mid-conversation as soon as they realized he was in the room. Every pair of eyes landed on him, some filled with respect, some with barely concealed panic, and others, like those of the higher-ups in expensive suits, narrowed with confusion, trying to calculate just how much damage control they would have to do before the night was over. A studio executive, an older man with perfectly combed silver hair and a deep tan that was just slightly unnatural, stepped forward, forcing a chuckle that did nothing to hide the nervousness in his voice. "Dwayne, there you are. We were wondering when you'd—" "I was outside," Dwayne cut in smoothly, the barest trace of amusement in his voice. "Just saying hi to the fans." The executive's face twitched at that, his carefully rehearsed smile faltering just a little as the weight of the situation settled over him. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Oh, right, yes. Well, we're all set to start the screening in just a few minutes. We've got some press lined up afterward. And of course, there's the after-party." Dwayne didn't acknowledge any of it. His eyes swept the room, landing on a cluster of security personnel stationed near the entrance to the VIP seating area, their heads ducked slightly, clearly hoping they wouldn't be the next ones dragged into the mess their colleague had created outside. One of them, a man in his 40s with a radio clipped to his jacket, hesitated before stepping forward, his voice professional but cautious. "Mr. Johnson, if there's anything we can do to—" "Yeah," Dwayne interrupted, his voice just as steady as it had been on the red carpet. "You can get Jeff in here." The security officer's face tightened instantly, his throat working as if he wasn't sure whether he should even acknowledge what had just been said. The executive gave a nervous chuckle, stepping in quickly. "Dwayne, there's no need for that. The situation outside was just a—" Dwayne turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto the man so sharply that the next words died in his throat before they could even leave his lips. The room felt smaller now, the background chatter dimming, every movement slowing as the weight of his presence settled over everyone like a force they couldn't escape. "I said," Dwayne repeated, his voice quieter this time but carrying twice the weight, "get Jeff in here." The security officer nodded stiffly before turning and disappearing through the entrance, the executive shifting uncomfortably beside him, his face now fully betraying the stress of the moment. Dwayne didn't move, didn't say anything else, didn't bother filling the silence that stretched between them. He just stood there, his hands resting casually in his pockets, his expression unreadable as the minutes passed, the weight of his request pressing down on the entire theater. And then Jeff walked in. He looked different now, like someone who had just spent the last few minutes realizing that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. His shoulders were stiff, his face locked into an expression that was meant to look professional but was cracking at the edges, his eyes darting quickly between his superiors and Dwayne, who hadn't moved an inch since making the request. The executive took a step forward, clearly ready to step in, to handle things before they could spiral any further. But Dwayne lifted a single hand, stopping him before he could even open his mouth. Jeff swallowed hard. Dwayne took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them in a way that made it impossible for Jeff to do anything but stand there and take it. "You know," Dwayne said, his voice perfectly calm, "when I walked up to that carpet, I was just planning to shake a few hands, take a few pictures, maybe make someone's night a little better." He tilted his head slightly, watching as Jeff struggled to keep his breathing even. "You remember what you said to me?" Jeff's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Dwayne let the silence stretch, let it become unbearable, let the entire audience feel the weight of it pressing down. "You said I didn't look like someone who belonged there." His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even accusing. It was just a statement, laid out in the open for everyone to absorb. Jeff exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "I didn't recognize you." "Yeah," Dwayne said simply. "You didn't." For a second, it seemed like that was all he was going to say, like he was just going to let Jeff sit with that. Let him feel the depth of his own words, let the entire world understand the implications behind them. But then, to everyone's surprise, Dwayne took a small step back, nodding slightly as if coming to a conclusion that only he understood. "I'm not going to ask you for an apology," he said finally. "Not here. Not in front of everyone." He let that settle, watching as Jeff processed it, as he struggled between relief and something deeper, something heavier. Dwayne turned his head toward the executive, his expression still unreadable. "This guy still have a job?" The executive blinked, clearly caught off guard, before scrambling to respond. "Oh, well, I mean, we'll have to." Dwayne didn't wait for the answer. Instead, he turned back to Jeff, held his gaze for a long moment, and then extended his hand. Jeff froze. No one breathed. Then, slowly, hesitantly, Jeff lifted his own hand and clasped Dwayne's in a firm shake. Dwayne didn't smile, didn't soften, didn't make it easy, but he didn't humiliate him either. And when he finally pulled his hand away, he gave Jeff one last look before stepping past him and walking toward his seat. The conversation over, the moment closed, the lesson learned. The crowd remained silent for a beat longer, absorbing everything that had just happened. And then, as Dwayne sat down in his reserved seat, as the lights in the theater dimmed, as the screen flickered to life, the murmurs finally started up again. Not about the movie, not about the premiere, but about him, and the way he had just handled everything with nothing but presence, patience, and a single handshake. The movie had started, but no one in the theater was fully focused on it. The massive screen displayed the opening sequence, explosions and battle cries filling the room, but the real tension wasn't on screen. It was still lingering in the air, in the way people shifted in their seats, in the quiet whispers passing from one side of the room to the other. No one had expected the night to take such a bizarre turn, and now, no matter how big the production was, no matter how much money had been poured into making Titan's Wrath a spectacle, the only thing on everyone's mind was Dwayne Johnson and what had just unfolded before them. He sat in his reserved seat, his expression neutral, his massive arms resting comfortably as if he hadn't just flipped an entire Hollywood premiere on its head. He wasn't watching the movie. Not really. His eyes were on the screen, but his mind was still processing, replaying the events, not with anger or frustration, but with that same deep, measured calculation that made him more than just an action star. He had power, not just the kind that came from physicality, but the kind that came from understanding exactly how people worked. He knew what had happened out there wasn't just a mistake. It was a mindset, a reflex, the kind that made people assume who belonged where, who had access, who deserved to be treated with respect without question. And the way Jeff had frozen when confronted, the way the executives had scrambled to fix it without actually addressing the real issue, it told him everything he needed to know. A figure slid into the empty seat next to him, moving quietly but not hesitantly. He didn't have to look to know who it was. The assistant from earlier, the one with the clipboard, the one who had been the first to react with something other than damage control. She exhaled softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't think I've ever seen an entire PR team have a collective heart attack before. Dwayne smirked slightly, still not turning his head. That's so. She leaned back in her seat, glancing around, noting the way people were still subtly glancing in his direction despite their best efforts to pretend they were watching the film. They're scrambling. You know that, right? They're probably back there right now, drafting statements, trying to figure out how to spin this before the clips go viral. Dwayne finally turned his head slightly, looking at her with quiet amusement. Before. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Fine. As the clips go viral. She hesitated, her fingers tapping against the clipboard she was still holding. You could have handled that a lot of ways. You could have made a scene, demanded someone get fired, walked away, done an angry Instagram live. Dwayne chuckled, shaking his head. Not my style. I know, she said, studying him. That's what makes it worse for them. He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. She glanced toward the back of the room, toward where she knew the executives were likely gathered, whispering amongst themselves, their minds racing through every possible outcome. They're not panicking because you were mad. They're panicking because you weren't. Dwayne tilted his head slightly, letting her words settle, because she was right. He had seen it before, time and time again, the way people in power reacted when confronted, not to anger, not to loud voices, not to outrage, but to calm, to someone who understood their influence and didn't need to shout to make it felt. He had given them nothing to fight against, no scandal to twist, no public meltdown to control. He had simply existed in the moment, let them make their own mistakes, and now they were the ones dealing with the consequences. The assistant glanced down at her clipboard, flipping through a few pages as if confirming something before speaking again. They're going to try and meet with you after this. Dwayne hummed in acknowledgement, unsurprised. They'll apologize, obviously. Offer some kind of PR stunt to smooth things over. Maybe a charity donation in your name, a diversity and security training program, something that looks good for them. She paused. And they'll ask you not to talk about it. He let that sit for a moment, then leaned back, stretching slightly, his voice as casual as if they were discussing weekend plans. What do you think I should do? She hesitated, then answered honestly. I think they're hoping you'll just let it go. And what do you think? She looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment before she sighed. I think you already know exactly what you're going to do. Dwayne nodded slightly, his smirk returning, but this time, there was something else behind it, something that hinted at the fact that he wasn't done yet. Not with the executives. Not with Jeff. Not with the way this whole thing had played out. The assistant shook her head, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. They have no idea what's coming, do they? Dwayne's smirk widened just a little as he finally turned his attention fully to the movie, the battle on screen playing out in dramatic, over-the-top spectacle. They never do. The moment the credits rolled and the lights came back on, movement in the theater shifted instantly. The applause was scattered, half-hearted, more out of obligation than genuine excitement. Normally, this was the moment where the director, the stars, and the studio executives would stand, smiling and shaking hands, basking in the glory of another blockbuster. But tonight, no one could focus on the film. Every glance, every whisper, every lingering gaze was directed toward Dwayne Johnson, the man who had just turned his own premiere into something Hollywood would be talking about for years. Dwayne stood up slowly, stretching his arms slightly, the way he always did after sitting for too long, as if nothing unusual had happened tonight. He could feel the weight of a dozen people watching his every move, studio heads shifting uncomfortably, security guards trying to pretend they weren't sweating, assistants whispering into their phones, waiting for a signal that would tell them how to salvage this disaster. Before he could take a step, the lead executive, the same one who had stumbled through an apology earlier, was already approaching, a practiced smile on his face but tension in his eyes. Dwayne, listen, about tonight. Dwayne didn't react. He didn't need to. The executive faltered slightly, hesitating before forcing a chuckle that barely masked his unease. Obviously, what happened outside was unacceptable, a complete misunderstanding, and trust me, we're already taking steps to make sure. You're handling it, Dwayne said, his voice neutral, calm, yet carrying a weight that made the executive shift slightly where he stood. Of course, the man continued quickly, nodding. We want to make things right. We'd love to coordinate a response with you, put out something positive, maybe a statement addressing. Dwayne raised a hand slightly, stopping him mid-sentence. Don't need a statement. The executive blinked, mouth opening slightly before closing again. Dwayne let the silence stretch. He could feel the assistant from earlier still watching from a few seats away, waiting, knowing this conversation wasn't going to go the way the studio hoped. He didn't rush. He let them sit in their discomfort. "You're thinking about headlines," Dwayne said, finally breaking the silence. "I'm thinking about the guy who lost his job tonight." The executive stiffened slightly, but quickly recovered. "Well, where is he?" The shift in tone was subtle, but immediate. The executive glanced toward the other studio heads, his carefully constructed expression faltering for just a moment before regaining control. "Dwayne, there's really no need to it." "Where is he?" Dwayne repeated, his voice still calm, but this time, it wasn't a question. The room went silent. A hesitant movement near the side entrance caught Dwayne's eye. Jeff, standing near the doors, his posture rigid, his face unreadable, waiting, knowing he had no control over what came next. He had been left out of this conversation on purpose, kept away from the decision-making, because the studio had already made up its mind about what was going to happen to him. Dwayne didn't wait for permission. He turned and walked straight toward Jeff. The security guard tensed, his hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable but his body language betraying the fact that he had already accepted his fate. Dwayne stopped in front of him, just standing there for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle. "They fire you yet?" Jeff's throat moved slightly as he swallowed. Then he gave a stiff nod. "They said it was best for the company." Dwayne tilted his head slightly, studying him. "That what you want?" Jeff hesitated for just a second, then exhaled sharply, his jaw clenching. "Does it matter?" "It does now," Dwayne said simply. For the first time, Jeff's carefully held composure cracked just slightly. He looked at Dwayne, searching his face for something, anger, humiliation, a chance to make an example out of him. But there was none of that. Just the same presence that had made the entire room freeze earlier, the same quiet intensity that didn't need to be loud to be felt. "I was wrong," Jeff finally said, the words coming out flat, like they had been sitting in his chest since the moment he realized what he had done. "I looked at you and made a decision before you even had a chance to say a word. I don't expect you to care, but that's the truth." Dwayne nodded once, as if acknowledging the statement but not letting it end there. "And if you had another shot?" Jeff let out a slow breath, looking down for a brief second before locking eyes with him again. "I wouldn't make the same mistake twice." Dwayne studied him for another second, then nodded, turning slightly back toward the executives who were still watching from a distance, their carefully concealed panic growing worse by the second. "I want him reinstated." The lead executive immediately stepped forward, forcing another chuckle. "Dwayne, I understand where you're coming from, but we can't just—" "You can't," Dwayne corrected, his voice carrying across the room. "And you will." The executive blinked rapidly, struggling for words, looking around as if someone might step in to help. Dwayne let the silence stretch. "You've got two choices," he continued, his tone still eerily calm. "You can make a statement about how you fired a man because he made a bad call, one mistake, one bad judgment, after years of working security. Or you can make a statement about how your company believes in second chances, in learning from mistakes, and actually fixing the problem instead of just covering it up." The executive's jaw tightened slightly, his brain working through the weight of that choice, the fact that he had already lost control of this entire situation. Dwayne waited. The silence stretched. And then, finally, the executive exhaled, forcing another tight smile. "We'll review his status immediately." Dwayne didn't react, didn't thank him, didn't nod in approval. He simply turned back to Jeff. "You're back on the job." Jeff stood there, looking at him, searching for some sign of condescension, some hint that this was about pity, about making himself look good, about turning this into another public lesson. But there was nothing. Just a man standing in front of him, offering him a choice. Jeff nodded once, sharp, professional, controlled. "Understood." Dwayne gave him one last look, then turned, walking past the executives, past the guests, past the whispers still floating through the room, past the security team that had spent the entire night making mistakes they didn't even realize they were making. The doors opened. The night air hit him. The cameras were still out there, waiting, ready to capture whatever came next. The world would know by morning. The story would be everywhere. The security guard who tried to kick out the rock. The reaction no one expected. The way it all ended. Dwayne didn't care. Because he had made sure that tonight wasn't just about a movie. It was about doing the right thing. And making damn sure people remembered it.